Oh, today is gonna be fun. We've got a complex tale ahead of us, friends. And it's got everything for observers of the Christosphere. It has evangelicals coping about their decline, Calvinists being weird, callbacks to SBC history, and the new upcoming civil war that the hardliners want so bad. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today is Friday, June 5th, 2026. This is Roll to Disbelieve, and I'm Captain Cassidy. Thank you for joining me. I went a bit long today, so I've got to behave myself in this little section. This one just had so many threads to weave together. I hope you like the results. And before we get going on it, I would like to thank my patrons and supporters. I couldn't do this work without you. Thank you so much. You are essential. If you'd like to become one of them, I welcome your support as well. Please check out the end of today's write-up, either on Patreon under Roll to Disbelieve, one word, or over at our official site, rolltodisbelieve.com. Thank you for whatever you decide to do. And now, our situation report. Trevin Wax writes a post for Baptist Press to get the flocks ready for the next big purity spiral. On May 28th, Baptist Press ran an editorial by Trevin Wax. It's titled, Considerations Before the SBC Annual Meeting in 2026. SBC, of course, being the Southern Baptist Convention, still, somehow, the biggest Protestant denomination in America. This post functions as an encore to a very similar post he wrote back in 2023, right down to the number of considerations he lists. And we'll be circling back to that post in a few minutes. In the more recent post, Wax describes two competing impulses in the SBC that form a serious tension for members. These impulses are church autonomy and confessional lockstep among member churches. And we will describe both of those shortly. He thinks that in recent years, the SBC has moved ever closer to that lockstep end of the equation. And I gotta say, that claim is fairly well supported by the denomination's data releases. As it does so, SBC members find themselves getting way more friendly with the notion of kicking out churches that aren't in lockstep. However, the way Wax is framing this whole situation is rhetorical sleight of hand. He is trying to make both impulses seem equally valid at a time when the SBC's official guidelines do not give that impression. It feels like he's just trying to make the idea of kicking out churches sound a lot more okay in a denomination that's always paid lip service, and a lot of it, to the idea of churches being autonomous. Then Wax describes a major event in the SBC's somewhat recent past, the Conservative Resurgence. He describes it as a sad but necessary and natural process. Oh, no, it was not. Not at all. And I'll show you what I mean. In actuality, the resurgence was a hostile takeover of the SBC by hyper-conservative schemers who had figured out the denomination's cheat codes. And then Wax gives us a brief history of the SBC kicking out member churches. The point is, they really didn't do it before about 2000, and they've only done it a few times since, but the number of churches getting kicked out is slowly increasing with time. It's almost a snowball effect. Wax gives us that brief history, and then he ends by explicitly framing the upcoming civil war he wants as a response to women in leadership. He does not like the idea of any woman having a leadership position that allows her to boss around men, even one man, in any way. And I gotta say, this framing and this response isn't really very surprising. This past week, Al Mohler, another SBC leader, he's a seminary president, he's been in the Christosphere news of late for drilling down harder than ever on women pastors. But do you remember back when Al Mohler was actually totally fine with it? Roll to Disbelieve remembers. One of his idols in evangelicalism shamed him into changing his mind. True. He wrote about it himself. Overall, the Trevin Wax post is incredibly dishonest in its framing. Worse, Wax completely mischaracterizes the entire conservative resurgence itself, and he kind of leaves me with the impression that he's aching for another conservative takeover of the SBC. And yeah, they're already conservative, so way more conservative takeover. I don't think there's a lot of moderates left in the SBC. And none of this is new, not by a long shot. Turns out, without even realizing I've been doing it, I've been documenting this guy for years. And it turns out that this is his MO. This is how he works. He is an extremely high control fundamentalist, Calvinist, evangelical, and he works very hard on reframing really unpalatable ideas for the flocks. And this post fits perfectly into his MO. But he does face a huge problem. I don't think the SBC can afford another civil war right now. Like, at all. They may be polarizing further rightward lately, and I do think they are, yeah. Mostly because the less far-right people are leaving. But the denomination's overall health is very poor. They're a lot more fragile now than they were in the wild days of the conservative resurgence, and I've got the database to prove it. Yeah, this annual meeting this weekend is gonna be bonker nuts. I can't wait. If you can't tell, this is my favorite time of year. This is like Christmas for me. These guys are amazing to watch. So dysfunctional. Here's our first thread. Everyone meet Trevin Wax. He is the man behind this strange OP. And just so you know, OP is internet speak for original post. It can also mean original poster. So Trevin Wax is the OP who wrote our OP. It's all very context-driven. According to his bio in Baptist Press, Trevin Wax is the Vice President of Resources and Marketing for the North American Mission Board, NAM. It's a terrible acronym. Ooh. North American Mission Board is run by the SBC. It's one of their big denominational projects, and they try to plant churches and support missionaries stateside. There's an international mission board too, just so you know. So Trevin here is the Vice President of Resources and Marketing for NAM. He's also written a lot of books about the Bible, about Calvinist doctrines, exhortations to do more personal evangelism, and that's person-to-person recruitment, and of course slams on counterfeit gospels, as he calls it. His latest book is The Gospel Way Catechism, which was published July 2025. And catechism is learning a religion's doctrines. He also runs a podcast for NAM called Reconstructing Faith. Its blurb over at NAM says that it's about what it will take to bring about renewal of the church in our generation. Of note, renewal doesn't mean revival. Nope, not in Christianese. In Calvinist Christianese, renewal means making more evangelicals into fervent Calvinists. His blurb at the Apple Podcast page makes that fact crystal clear. They want people to be Calvinists. They think that'll fix everything. Interestingly, his blurb at Baptist Press does not mention one of his most visible gigs. He writes a lot of posts, as in a lot, for the Gospel Coalition, or TGC. TGC is a hardline Calvinist evangelical site, and I know about him from there. By the way, it's to the point where when I found out he worked for NAM, I was like, wait, what? Did I know that already? Because it just escapes the mind. I only really read him on the Gospel Coalition. I don't really read him anywhere else. So I found out last year he belonged to NAM. Been talking about this guy for, who knows how long, but just pieced out the NAM part, I think, last year. And when I say I know about him from TGC, I mean it. Here's the quick rundown of what I've observed of this guy's pattern of behavior. In 2022, I reviewed his chapter contribution for the TGC production, Before You Lose Your Faith. It was an anthology of essays aimed at stopping people from deconstructing. Deconstruction is the process of critically evaluating your beliefs. Oftentimes it ends with the evangelical leaving evangelicalism. It isn't a full deconversion, though it certainly can lead that way, but it is definitely a problem for evangelicals. So they wanted to attack deconstruction hard, these Calvinists, and that was this book. He titled his chapter, Doubt Your Way Back to Truth. How hilarious is that? It was just more of the same attempt to label easy questions as serious ones. But here, he also tried to take power over doubt itself. He set up categories of permissible doubt and impermissible doubt. The latter is what he thinks leads to deconstruction, while the proper kind of doubt only leads back to full renewal. And you know renewal means becoming a fervent Calvinist. And what was so funny about this guy's chapter is it's clear that he just completely assumed that anybody who was deconstructing or deconverting cared enormously about his personal approval of why it was happening. Y'all, they don't want to be salespeople. They don't want to even be ambassadors. They want to be the Lord's. They want to be the ones who control everyone else. In 2023, the next year, Trevin Wax pops up in a post about how evangelicals were trying to reframe church attendance as mandatory. Now, the TGC post he wrote that I mentioned here was actually written in 2019, before the pandemic. But I bet he only drilled down harder on those ideas after 2020. And then, last year, 2025, I tackled his podcast. And this podcast was so bad. He actually thought he had nailed all those hard questions. That's what he called them. And then, having nailed the hard questions, he announced that he had just totally won the fight against doubt and deconstruction. Nobody was allowed to do them anymore for impermissible reasons. He had already fixed and answered the hard questions. Sure, buddy. Also in 2025, I wrote about Christianity's decline and about how evangelicals were coping about it. And in the doing, cited a 2014 post he had written for TGC. In that post, he declared that evangelicalism wasn't dying. Oh, it was in decline, sure, okay, maybe, but not dying. And really, if you think about it, tons of people were drawn in by the power of repentance, and they were converting. Even if more were drifting away afterward, they were totally bagging people left and right. Of course, nobody said evangelicalism was dying in the first place. Not even I thought that. Dude was just moving some goalposts to make evangelicals' position seem a lot stronger than it was. And I could name other posts he's written to support my opinion of him. Like in 2022, I noticed he was suggesting that the younger generation wants to be a lot more confrontational and fighty. No. Millennials, sure. Millennials are noted for being a lot more fighty, especially online. And they are deeply political. But not Gen Z. I think that if Trevin Wax is telling the truth about this, he might just be considering millennials the younger generation. Or he might be hanging around a lot of Gen Z Calvinists, especially the men. There is definitely a subset of far-right Calvinist young men, Gen Z guys, and they get involved with Calvinism basically for the aesthetics. And out of all of the evangelicals, Calvinists are definitely the most fighty anyway. So when I say this guy decides what his reality is going to look like every morning, and then refuses to accept anything different, I am speaking from years of experience. He writes and speaks as though he thinks if he can just set the terms of engagement for everybody's experience, then he can take control of deconversion. He can control the outward-bound flow of Christians from evangelical churches. Even stranger, he thinks that if everybody just becomes Calvinist, then Christianity will be fixed. So now that we know who Trevin Wax is, let's talk about the Conservative Resurgence. Many decades ago, like in the late 60s, Calvinists convinced the SBC's biggest names to become literalist and inerrant in their interpretation of the Bible. Literalism and inerrancy mean that the Bible is literally true in every single way, even when it groups bats with birds, and that it makes zero errors of any kind. It was an easy sell, honestly. Those big names were getting super upset about the growing number of women becoming pastors in SBC churches. It may not sound like a big deal to modern people, especially non-evangelicals, but it was a big problem then. And inerrancy gave these misogynists a trump card that blocked women's progress. They made their interpretation of the Bible into this perfect, divine command for all time for all humans, and then they pointed to that inerrancy doctrine when they forbade women leadership roles over any men. Problem instantly solved. So yes, complementarianism really is sort of an argument from authority. Well, we can't do that. The Bible says not to do that. But next week, wait until you see what I have for you. Oh, it's going to be good. Two schemers absorbed this inerrancy and literalism combo package. They were a lawyer named Paul Pressler and a regular SBC seminary student named Paige Patterson. These two SBC guys figured out exactly how to set inerrancy so deep within the SBC's heart that nobody could ever withdraw it. And this is where my past as a tabletop gamer comes into play, because what they were really doing was what we call min-maxing, making the most out of available resources, taking advantage of problems and loopholes and weak points in a rule system. And in this case, our two schemers realized that SBC denominational leadership had a very serious weakness. The president of the SBC appoints a lot of committee roles. A lot. So if they could capture the SBC presidency for a solid 10 years, just 10 years, they do the elections every year, and a president can be president for 2 consecutive years. So if they could just do this, just have the SBC president be their guy for 10 years, then in theory, their guys could get enough inerrantists into power, into committees all up and down the SBC, and they could shape the entire direction of the entire denomination. First, though, they needed to get a groundswell of support. While they were gearing up to make the plan happen, they toured the country selling SBC pastors everywhere on inerrancy. And this took them, for real, 12 years. Once they thought they had enough people, in 1979, they got Adrian Roger elected to the SBC's presidency. And like a lot of their pawns at the time, he didn't even know about the plan. He didn't know about the loophole. He didn't know they were going to use his presidency to start that process of getting their guys into key committee roles. Once the schemers had gotten enough important pieces onto the board, enough presidents, enough committees, enough their guys, they performed a hostile takeover of the SBC. This was not a gentle, corrective, wise, self-selecting process. No. Trevin Wax wants to describe it that way, but it wasn't. As one example of just how brutal this whole thing was, in 1994, so about 5 years before the very end of the whole takeover, those Resurgence lads fired Russell Dilday from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. He was in his 60s at the time, and he refused to take early retirement. So they fired this sweet old guy like they were scared he was gonna come back with a shotgun. They planned a surprise vote at the end of a argument-filled 3-day meeting. It was 26-7, if I remember correctly. And minutes after the vote, they had already changed the locks on his office. What were they afraid of him doing? Guys, Order 66 in Star Wars wasn't executed that cleanly. Eventually, Paige Patterson himself would take the presidency of that seminary in 2003, and then he'd lose it in 2018 amid revelations he had bungled sex assault investigations and accusations on his campus. And Pressler, if you're wondering, turns out to be an alleged serial rapist. Gosh, the two architects of the Conservative Resurgence turned out to be such major hypocrites. Isn't it strange? So yes, during this process, which ended around 2000, churches did self-select out of the SBC, to the tune of almost 2,000 of them over the 20-ish years of the formal fight. It did not look like what Trevin Wax suggests, though. It wasn't a strategic uncoupling, so much as it was this big, messy drama filled with fighting and bad blood and accusations. After the divorce, so to speak, was fully finalized around 2000, the hardliners failed to fulfill a single marketing promise about it. Yeah, they promised that the SBC would start growing again. It totally didn't. In fact, it was in pretty solid decline starting soon afterward, around 2005. So as you can probably guess, knowing what you know now about exactly how this whole hostile takeover occurred, you might understand why I am just aghast at this framing of the conservative resurgence. But he's doing it for a reason. See, he wants another one. The first one didn't quite take. He wants a second one. And he is not the only SBC hardliner who does. He's been itching for this fight for years. But in 2000, the resurgence lads thought they had won. They thought they were finished with fighting for control of the SBC. They even installed a new official SBC doctrinal statement. They call it the Baptist Faith and Message 2000, or BFM 2K, or just BFM. And this statement clearly laid out inerrancy and defined the SBC's position on various culture war issues, notably women in leadership over men. But that fight wasn't done. Nope. And the basic problem here is a tension between those two impulses that Trevin Wax mentioned. See, the SBC prides itself on respecting church autonomy. That means that they're pretty hands-off with the individual member churches. Those church leaders have, in theory, a lot of leeway about exactly what they preach and teach. A church that technically isn't in complete agreement with the SBC's doctrinal stances should, in theory, be able to contribute to its denominational projects. And these are important projects to the SBC. They're evangelism, church planting, missionary support, the seminaries. The policy has a very earthly purpose as well, of course. Whenever the SBC mothership doesn't want to take responsibility for something that a member church did, they point to church autonomy. Oh, guys, we don't like it, but we just can't interfere. But the Trevin Waxes of the SBC, they don't like knowing that some SBC church somewhere doesn't completely agree with the BFM. In particular, the Trevin Waxes don't like knowing that a lot of SBC member churches are fine with women in leadership roles over men. Many even have women as lead pastors. The megachurches, by the way, a lot of them have women in those leadership roles. So the hardliners are caught in a very difficult bind. Officially, they shouldn't care what the member churches are doing. But they do care. They care a lot. They want to make it so that no SBC member can ever even think about hiring a woman to lead, even one man, in any capacity. Officially, that would make the SBC a confessional identity denomination. It wouldn't be a church autonomy group anymore. And I don't think Trevin Wax quite understands that shifting to confessional identity might open the SBC up to the same exact liabilities that the Catholic Church is facing. I mean, they've still got a sex abuse crisis that they have barely touched since 2019. I think they've just kind of given up and hoped the flocks have forgotten. Trevin Wax has been really hard at work trying to convince SBC church leaders to be okay with a shift toward confessional identity. And it makes sense then that Trevin Wax wrote a post about the growing number of times the SBC mothership has disciplined and even cast out member churches for various reasons. He wants to make that control sound like a very sensible course of action. Like it's a wise process that keeps the SBC squeaky clean. Like, yeah, of course, a confessional identity matters more nowadays than church autonomy. And for his next civil war to work, Trevin Wax needs the SBC to be focused on that doctrinal lockstep. More than that, he needs members to be okay with purity testing and casting out the impure. And that, in a nutshell, is what his entire hardliner faction has in store for the annual meeting this weekend. Yeah, it actually starts tonight, Friday night. Trevin Wax has been priming that pump, though, for ages. Remember that 2023 post I mentioned that we were going to come back to? We're doing that now. It wasn't nearly as polished as the 2026 version, but it covered almost the same ground. In it, he dishonestly presents a bunch of non-starter differences of opinion that member churches might have that nobody in the SBC gives a fuck about. We're talking about letting people take communion in church even if they were baptized as infants and maybe even by sprinkling. I'm suddenly wondering if they do any dunking of babies. Jesus, oh my God, I don't want to think about that. Another one of his non-starters is exactly how they should approach religious liberty, even for Muslims. Or even how powerful pastors are in relation to their church elders. In a lot of churches, the elders are in control, not really the pastor. They brought him into that church and they can take him back out again. And let me tell you, Calvinists want the pastor to be the supreme ruler of the church. They are way into that authoritarian discipleship shit. Here's the thing, though. I don't think I have ever seen anyone in SBC leadership make those issues into deal breakers. Nuh-uh, not like women pastors. In the post, he even admits that nobody cares if a member church handles those issues in different ways than others might like. Rather, he's saying that the SBC was okay with those differences, even if now they need to not be okay with doctrinal drift from the BFM. And as he does in the 2026 post, in this 2023 one, he also tries to make the casting out of dissenting churches into a more normal, expected part of SBC business. But there's a problem in his way. The SBC can't afford the civil war that the hardliners obviously want. Indeed, the SBC's hardliner faction braces now for another set of big fights, and about the same exact things they fought about 40 years ago. But this time around, the SBC is in a far more fragile state. Every member church that self-selects out or gets kicked out takes with it all its money and its membership counts. The SBC's membership is already in freefall. Its leaders don't even know how to stop the bleed. Hell, they don't even know really why it's happening. Back in the original Conservative Resurgence, they were still growing despite their losses. Across the 20 years of the big fight, they lost about 2,000 churches. And that was rough, yes. But the SBC was growing so well that it could absorb those losses pretty well. Over those years, they grew consistently in membership. They had a net loss of members only in 1998, and it was 162,000. That year, they also saw their only net loss of churches, and it was 17, not many at all. The situation is completely different in 2026. They are stretched so much thinner. They've got almost 4 million fewer members. They've lost churches consistently since 2022, and lots of them, and baptisms are nowhere near fully rebounded. They're struggling even to maintain donation levels. Nah, I don't think they could absorb those losses now, not like they did then. So it's going to be really interesting to see how they handle the next couple of years. I think if the hardliners get their way, the SBC is going to collapse. Oh, it'll probably last for decades more, don't get me wrong. But they'll go from managed decline to freefall. I really think that. After the last Civil War, the hardliners had fucked them so royally, and nobody's learned a thing. They think that this time they'll do it right. They'll fix everything. It'll be good. But it won't. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. It was a little longer than usual, but hopefully worth it. Next up, speaking of the 2026 annual meeting starting today, this year's Battle of the Factions is already heating up. I can't wait. We're going to cover the squabbles next time. And you are cordially invited to join me for that. Until then, this is Captain Cassidy signing off. Have a great weekend, everybody. I hope it's fun and the weather's beautiful. And we will see you again soon.